I'm not a real fan of using the tax code to socially and economically engineer. I think we oftentimes do far more harm than good. And I want to lay out an example in Milwaukee for Mr. Watson, because you kind of touched on this. There's a great program I visited a number of years ago called the ACTS, A-C-T-S housing program. They had an opportunity because there are all these homes, built in the 20s, 30s, wonderful construction, but they're in foreclosure, and so this program could buy these homes literally for a few $1,000s, then working with the banks, making low interest loans available to low-income individuals, literally for $30,000, $40,000 they could renovate a home, put a lot of sweat equity in, and it worked great. I mean, they were cutting their rental payments from, by hundreds of dollars a month. It was a great program working. When I visited them a couple of years ago, they were complaining that these tax credits, federal tax credits, going in the pockets of developers were causing developers to dramatically increase the cost of that housing, and then it was going to more gentrified neighborhoods, and all of a sudden they couldn't buy these homes. It was really hampering a very successful program. So that's just one example. But I want to focus my questions on, I think, a statement Ms. Geno talked about, that we simply can't, the market simply can't supply low-cost housing. Why? I mean, again, I see the costs. You've got land, you got labor, you got construction. Let's go through that. I mean, for example, in Wisconsin, the average cost of a family home is somewhere around $250,000. With the trade wars, the cost of lumber was, just a year or so ago, $35,000 was the increase per new home construction. The lack of workers. So again, Mr. Calabria, can you just talk about those factors? What is government potentially doing, making impossible for the marketplace, which should not be impossible?
I very much share your frustration, Senator. Let's set aside the number of households who would have zero or near zero income who can't afford anything, and we'll come back to them. But the reason the market is not filling the needs of affordable housing is because we aren't letting it. And we need to remove those barriers, predominantly at the state and local level, some at the federal level. And then for those households who cannot afford it because their income is zero or near zero, we should do.
So again, let's zero into those barriers. I mean, how much do we drive up construction costs by all of the environmental regulations we put on products? Drive up the cost of a washing machine or a range or whatever. What again, the trade wars and driving up the price of lumber. Can you, specifically talk about what government, how government drives up the cost of every component in construction?
So a recent National Association of Home Builders study, I think done in association with Sharon's organization, found that the cost of regulation was about 40% of the cost of development of multifamily. Personally, I think that's probably an underestimate in terms of taking in zoning into account. But we can see this.
So put that in dollar terms, 40%. So if a standard multi is $1 million, I mean, that's $400,000 added cost that wouldn't have to be there. Now, some of those regulations may be necessary. Maybe the cost is some. I'm not sure all.
I mean, I think a good way of looking at this is we can see very similar units in places like Texas that are built for $200,000 that in places like California may even approach $1 million, as you mentioned. So there are places where we've shown you can build housing, you can build it affordably, you can be accessible. We know how to do this.
So again, just for ease of calculation, let's say $1 million piece of property. If the cost regulation is $40,000, what is the benefit of a tax credit, Mr. Watson?
Clearly the low-income housing tax credit and these other credits are just offsetting some of this, added regulatory
That's the point I'm trying to make here.
Overall.
We're a dog chasing its tail.
Exactly.
We're causing the problem, driving up the cost by 40%, and then we're offering what percent relief from that burden? That's the question I'm asking. Can you put a percentage to it?
I'm not sure if there's a strict percentage, but I think I think you mentioned this, is not only is it the regulatory and these other costs, material costs, but we really shouldn't be adopting policies that magnify that. I think you mentioned the trade war being one, and others that are just going to erode the value of the credit. And I think the zoning issue is really important too, because to the extent, I think Dr. Calabria said this, that supply is constrained, that may actually magnify the amount of the benefit that's just going to the developers and not to those low-income
So it's extremely important to put numbers to this so we can understand the root cause. So again, we're not chasing our tails. And again, the root cause is regulation increasing this, trade wars, a worker shortage. We need to focus all that. And by the way, a simpler and more rational tax code would also reduce costs for people as well. So rather than make it more complex, add another barnacle onto the ship of state, slow it down even further, we ought to talk about scraping the barnacles off. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Carper's next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, one and all. Welcome to Delaware. So, there's an outpost here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for...
For having to cut people off. Senator Johnson's next.
Did you call on me? Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Yellen. I just want to start. Do you know how much a dollar that you held at the start of the Biden administration in January 2021 is worth today?
Well, we've had inflation, and it's declined in its purchasing power.
It's worth 87 cents. In your testimony, you said that inflation is the #1 economic problem. Do you know what the inflation rate was at the start of the Biden administration in January 2021?
It was substantially lower.
It was 1.4%. You said that inflation has many causes. I agree with that. By the way, I would say that the #1 economic problem is our debt and deficit. And I would say that the top 3 causes of inflation are massive deficit spending, the war on fossil fuels, which have driven gasoline prices to record levels, obviously supply chain dislocation. That was caused by our miserably failed and incredibly stupid response to COVID, the pandemic. But would you agree those are the top 3 causes of inflation? Deficit spending, high energy costs, and supply dislocations?
I don't believe that deficit spending is one of the main causes of inflation.
I mean, inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods.
Well,
so when you're printing all this out, so do you know in the first 3 fiscal years of the Biden administration, you know how much the total deficit spending is going to be?
We had an economic collapse that was caused by the
right, and
pandemic.
we were certainly coming out of that because there's all this pent-up demand and a sloshing around of trillions of dollars. So I'll answer that question for you, too. The first 3 fiscal years of this administration, the total deficits would be about $5.7 trillion. So now you're here testifying about the president's budget. How much are the total deficits over that 10-year period according to the president's budget? You don't know that off the top of your head? Here, listen, I'm running out. It's $17 trillion, okay?
Yeah, that's
You're going to drive the debt from somewhere around $32 trillion up to about $50 trillion, correct?
yes, but what I believe is the single most important metric for judging the fiscal stance of the country is real net interest as a share of GDP.
Okay.
We have
so are you concerned
large
when you're taking the debt from $32 to $50 trillion? Are you concerned who's going to buy that debt, and also at what rate they'll expect to be compensated for buying riskier and riskier debt? Are you concerned about that?
Well, if the real net interest cost of the debt remains low relative to GDP, and we're on a sustainable fiscal
Well, we're not on a sustainable path. Senator Cassidy was talking about the president's demagoguery on Social Security, unwillingness to try and save Social Security. If we do nothing, and the Social Security Trust Fund runs out 2023 to 2025, about the end of the budget period, are you concerned about, are we going to have the financial wherewithal to plus up benefits to honor those promises? I mean, you think we're going to, with $50 trillion in debt, a debt's exceeding our GDP, aren't you concerned about our inability to honor those promises?
The interest cost on the debt as a share of our economy remains quite low throughout the 10-year horizon of the president's budget. It remains around 1%.
Secretary, and you're also the one who said that
very manageable.
You also said that inflation was transitory, and it certainly isn't. And I think Chairman Powell certainly now agrees the fact that, no, we've got something going on here that's going to take a very long while, unfortunately, to wring out of our system. Not only you, but OMB Director Young and members of the other side keep talking about that you're cutting deficits. The deficit in 2021 obviously was high because of the pandemic. But in 2022 is about 1.4 trillion. 2023, we think it's going to be about 1.6 trillion. 2024, you're projecting 1.85 trillion, and again, growing debt by another 7. It never drops below 1.5 trillion dollars. How can you claim that you're cutting deficits?
Well, it always is a comparison with the baseline of what would happen if our policies were not
really
enacted, and the increase in deficits would be larger. There's net deficit reduction over 10 years.
Saying you're cutting the deficit is just misleading the American public. Let me ask you one final question. Because we always hear on the other side, same thing from OMB Director Young yesterday, that we want to make the rich pay their fair share. So, I mean, the fact is, and this is the latest figures we have from the Treasury, 2020, the top 1% made about 22% of income, but they paid 42.3% of the income tax. Now, I'm not going to ask you the metric. At what point? I mean, how much of the total income tax should the top 1% pay before you'll consider and before President Biden will consider they're finally paying their fair share? I mean, they're paying double the income tax that they're getting in income. It's obviously a highly progressive rate. By the way, the bottom, they're paying about
colleague's over his time, and I want the witness to answer his question.
Well, I believe that billionaires should pay rates that are not lower than what a teacher or firefighter pays.
Okay, the top 1% averages effective
The
rates.
time of the gentleman's expired. Senator Tillis is
My
next.
colleague got 7 minutes. The top 1% pay an
The time of the gentleman's
26%.
expired.
The bottom 50% pay 3.1. We have a highly progressive tax system.
Senator Tillis.
Senator Johnson, then Senator Stabenow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, welcome. Seeing as this is the Budget Committee, I'd like to separate rhetoric from actual numbers and start using some numbers. We've heard a lot of rhetoric in terms of the wealthy. In your testimony, you said the wealthy, quote, "we're going to begin to pay their fair share," unquote. So I think my question for you is, at what point will you consider the wealthy paying their fair share? The most recent analysis I have comes from the Tax Foundation for the tax year 2020, where the top 1% made 22.2% of the income, but paid 42.3% of the income tax. Now, 2019 analysis showed that they made about 21% of income and paid 24% of total federal tax. So again, the top 1% paid about 42.3% income tax and somewhere around 24% of total taxes. What would be a fair percent of total income taxes in your mind for the wealthy to pay?
So I will point out that you talked a lot about federal tax.
I also did total tax, about 24%. So in your mind, again, you have to use metrics here. When will the top 1% pay their fair share? What percent of income taxes, what percent of total taxes will be their fair share?
I'll go back to a statistic that I talked about earlier, where some analysis show 400 of the wealthiest families in this country pay an 8% effective rate.
So let me start. The top 1% pay an average of a 26% top rate. The bottom 50% pay 3.1%. So the bottom 50% pay 3.1%. The top 1% pay an effective rate of 26%. That's a pretty big delta. That's a progressive tax rate. Again, I want to know what should the top 1% pay in terms of total income tax? What should they pay as a percent of total tax? What percent should that be? Right now it's 42.3% of total income tax. It's around 24% of total tax.
Senator, I'm happy to take a look at the analysis you're looking at. I'm happy to share ours where.
No, I mean, listen, you don't even need to look at it. Right now it's 42%.
That's your analysis.
Should it be 50%? Should they pay 70% of the total income tax? Should they pay 50% of total tax? I mean, in your mind, to step away from rhetoric, at what point will you be satisfied that the top 1% are paying their fair share? I mean, you ought to be able to figure that off the top of your head.
Yeah, Senator, I've told you, and I'm happy to share this analysis. 400 of the wealthiest families in this country pay 8%.
That's not answering the question.
Okay.
Total tax paid in 2017 before Republican tax reform, $3.3 trillion revenue raised. Last year, 4.897. That's a 47.6% increase in total revenue raised. That's pretty good, don't you think? By the way, corporations paid in 2017 $297 billion. Last year, they paid $425 billion. That's a 43% increase. So again, we're raising a lot more revenue because of economic growth. I would say the tax reform worked in spurring economic growth. Those are just the facts. But in your testimony, you said that this budget, the president's budget, reduced the deficit. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, we ran a deficit of $984 billion, which is still way too much. In 2022, is $1.37 trillion. In 2023, it's projected to be over $1.5 trillion. The president's budget now is projecting $1.8 trillion. So from 1.3 to 1.5 to 1.8, how can you claim that's reducing the deficit?
Easily, Senator, my entire statement said we talk about 10-year budget windows. Over the 10-year budget window, if you go look at 2033, the president's budget will bring down deficits by $3 trillion, or nearly $3 trillion, 2.9.
But again, year to year. I mean, I think most people say when you're reducing the deficit, you're looking at year on year. So we're going from 1.3 trillion to 1.6 trillion to now 1.8 in the budget. You're actually increasing the deficit by about $300 billion in 2024 as your projection over the 2023 projection. You're increasing the deficit. And by the way, that's a massive deficit, $1.8 trillion. What do you think is sparking inflation, which caused the Fed to start increasing interest rates, which is causing the run on these banks? At what point are you going to acknowledge the harm that this massive deficit spending is causing our economy? You're certainly not recognizing in your 2024 budget.
Senator, what I hope we all realize is that inflation is a global phenomenon. The UK doesn't have the same laws over the last few years that the United States has, and it has inflation. India, the same.
Again, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
Senator, it absolutely has nothing to do with one piece of legislation. Every developed economy in the world is experiencing inflation. What that tells us is there's not one piece of legislation passed by the United States that has an impact, a large impact.
Trillions of dollars of deficit spending, trillions of dollars printed, chasing too few goods. That's what caused inflation, and that's what was promoted by this president. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn to Senator.
And Senator Johnson is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Curry, let me start with this statement that I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not a climate change alarmist. I get a feeling from listening to your testimony, maybe you're a little bit more on that scale with me than more of an alarmist. But I thought it was interesting in your testimony you talked about when you look at the real history of occurrences of hurricanes, I've certainly looked at the history of wildfires, that there's really nothing out of the ordinary in terms of long-term perspective on this. Can you expand a little bit more on what you're talking about? You're just referring to that in general. Can you get a little more specific?
Sure. Looking back in the historical record of extreme events, that in the first half of the 20th century, particularly the 1930s, the weather and climate extremes were much worse than anything we've seen so far in the 21st century, in terms of the worst landfalling hurricane, the worst heat waves, the worst droughts, the worst fires, and on it goes. And if you look at the paleoclimate record, you can extend even further back, and you see evidence of even greater extremes. The worst atmospheric river event in recorded history occurred in the 1861 to 1862 winter in California. I mean, we think it's bad this year, but it was much worse back in the 19th century. And even worse events that you can see in the paleoclimate records. So we need to temper our perception of what's actually going on right now with the extreme events.
So I appreciate that. And, we mentioned earlier witness talked about Silicon Valley Bank and what's happening there. what you have is a lack of confidence. And so if we have all these hair on fire predictions, it's going to reduce confidence, and it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's talk about the reality. You just talked a little bit about the reality of extreme events not being out of the ordinary. Mr. Theodoro, for my again, I don't deny the loss in property, but isn't that more related to the fact that we are building incredibly expensive properties in highly vulnerable areas, whether it's in mudslide areas in California or wildfire areas where we're not doing proper forest management to prevent wildfires? What we're building on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic shoreline, unbelievably expensive properties. So when a hurricane does occur, yeah, there's going to be a lot of property damage. So isn't the real issue here properly pricing the insurance and, quite honestly, making the owners pay for the risk that they're taking? And we don't do that. We subsidize that risk, and so there's more risk taking. Can you just kind of speak to that?
Yes, thank you, Senator Johnson, for the question. And it's both. And indeed, there are more values now that are at risk. There is more unsound development on coastal areas and on floodplains. There's more impervious surfaces as you have asphalt instead of dirt to absorb the water. So you have higher values, and that's the driver of the higher losses. But also, there are more of these extreme events. The 1861-1862 arc storm in California that led to Governor-elect Leland Stanford going to his inauguration in a rowboat in Sacramento was considered a 1-in-1,000-year event. That's why it was called an arc storm, A-R-K, atmospheric river K for 1,000. Research has shown that it was actually happening every 200 years. But more recent research from NOAA is now saying that this can happen every 40 or 50 years. So there are more of these extreme events. And as you said...
Okay, that's contrary to what Dr. Curry is talking about, but go on. By the way, do you have, the insurance industry, have you calculated the property value in these vulnerable areas today versus, let's say, 50 years ago? I mean, do you have a sense of how much more property is at risk? Whether or not we have more extreme events, I mean, when an event occurs, we're going to have a lot more property damage.
Yeah, the industry does tabulate this, and there are modelers that look at that. But indeed, the values have gone up because of population growth and building which is not sound. It's on coastal areas and on floodplains, not built to code. So that's an important factor, and we should discourage this sort of bad behavior and have protections, mitigation. But the evidence, the facts are looking at the events and the severity of the events that have been more frequency of severity.
So my point is that's something we can do something about, not building in vulnerable areas. We can do something about building to code. I don't think we can hold back the tides. So why don't we address what we can actually do versus scare the you-know-what out of everybody, reduce confidence. That doesn't help either. So thank you, Mr. Theodoro.
Indeed, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Dr. McBride pretty well laid out the solution here. It would be to simplify and rationalize our tax code. Unfortunately, we've done a pretty miserable job here in Congress of attempting to do that. But Dr. Yegan, Dr. McBride also laid out the facts according to the IRS in terms of what percentage of the total income the top 1% versus the bottom 50% make. So I won't repeat that. It is interesting that JCT looks at it slightly different. The top 1%, the floor of the income level there is $548,000 worth of income. JCT looks at people making over $500,000, and they say that they make about 22.7% of income, pay about 51.8% of total income taxes, 32.6% of total taxation, okay? So the question I have for both Dr. Yeagan and Dr. Klausing, assuming the top 1% makes about 22% of the income, what percent share of the total income tax should they pay? What would that be a fair share? Because we always hear from the other side, what would be fair? Right now they're paying almost double. Well, according to JCT, they're paying more than double taxation versus income. What would be fair? When are you going to be satisfied?
Thank you, Senator.
And I want a percentage. I don't want to, really, what percent? Should it be 51.8%? Should it be 60%, 70%, 80%?
You and your colleagues have earned millions of more votes than I have. I'm an economist, and I can speak to the economics of the policies. One key thing is that state and local taxes are actually regressive. And so when you talk to total tax burdens, they're pretty flat over the income distribution.
Dr. Clausen, what would you give me a figure on that? Again, I can never get this out of people. I mean, what would be a fair share? If you're making 22% income, how much percent of the income tax should you be contributing?
A lot of the statistics that you and others have raised on this issue concern labor tax burdens. And one of the things that both Professor Yegan and my own testimony point to is that there's a vast discrepancy between how we tax labor income and how we tax capital.
Okay, so
the
moves into my, so again, JCT shows 23% of income, but about 33% of total tax.
Yeah.
So should that be 50% or what?
The top, according to Treasury data, the top 1% of taxpayers have 52% of the positive capital income. And that's the income that's really undertaxed, both at the individual level, as we see in Professor Yegan's
Okay, well, I'm not going to get an answer. So let me move on. I think, Dr. Yegan, you were talking about turning what you don't think is pass-through income, it's really salary type of income, and turning it into pass-through and avoiding the Medicare tax. I mean, is that correct? So I mean, an example of that would be, let's say you're being paid royalty on a book, which in that case, I would actually, from my standpoint, having been a manufacturer, operating pass-through income businesses, when you're making income off of manufacturing, I would think that's like real business income and should be treated as pass-through. But a royalty on a book, I would say that probably should be attributed to people as real, like, salary income. Would you agree?
Yeah, labor income.
So what you're talking about in terms of that tax dodge is exactly what President Biden did when he turned royalty income in through, I think it's subchapter S, into pass-through income and didn't pay the Medicare tax, correct? Now, that's what you're talking about in terms of people turning what should be Medicare taxable income into pass-through income, right?
Yes, and same for, a private practice physician or others. They're all legally using the tax code, and it's just
so. Let me ask you this question: Social Security is, we tax that, and there's a limit to it because the deal with Social Security is you're basically pre-funding your own retirement fund. I mean, that's the. I know it's not really what happens, but I mean that's sort of the. Wouldn't you say that's sort of the same thing true with the Medicare? That you're paying all your lifetime, you're paying the Medicare tax to provide your Medicare benefit, but we don't limit the Medicare tax. So I would argue that's somewhat unfair. If you want to, change the deal, that this isn't really a payroll tax for your retirement, Medicare then ends up just being a general fund type of program, correct?
If I understood the question right, so Social Security benefits are a function of how much you pay in. So the more I pay in, the more I get. Medicare is a flat benefit, and so that has different.
Yeah, but again, if you're turning pass-through income, where it could be in a business, could be millions of dollars,
sure,
with no limit on that, you're paying an awful lot for health care in your retirement age. Let me just move on, because I think the other solution in terms of what you're talking about, trying to tax capital gains, which I think violates a basic principle of taxation, wherewithal to pay. Senator Kaine, I think, wrote favorably about what I was talking about in 2017, a true Warren Buffett tax, where we convert all business income into pass-through income and tax business income at the shareholder level. And I would do it based on a cash basis income. But wouldn't that also solve the problem? Now you're not going to have this buildup inside C Corps of non-distributed income. So if you just tax all business income at the shareholder level, by the way, I talked to Warren Buffett about this. I've talked to his shareholder services. It's entirely possible. You collect the tax on a backup withholding like you do the payroll tax. I mean, would you agree that that would be something we really ought to explore, some system like that?
There are multiple ways to skin the cat here. And, the Sinatra tax burden and the Walton tax burden is different now. What you can't do to equalize those tax burdens is both lower corporate tax rates and keep individual tax rates low. But as you say, if you would tax all corporate income in the year it's earned as ordinary income, that would equalize.
To the shareholders. And again,
yes,
tax at the shareholder level. That's what we do 95% of American businesses. So I'd love to work with the chairman in terms of working on that type of proposal, because it solves an awful lot of the problems that you're talking about here. So I look forward. We got a couple years to work on this because unfortunately, 95% of American businesses are facing a severe tax increase in 2026. And that's all the small businesses, you know, the people that are engines of innovation in our economy. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, quick little comment. You know, if this committee would focus on, spend all of our time and energy on simplifying the tax code. Stop trying to socially and engineer through the tax code. A lot of these issues, a lot of these problems would just evaporate or be a whole lot easier to tackle. So that's just my commentary. Mr. Commissioner, welcome. You're quoting statistics of 87% response rate versus 15% last year. Where are you getting those numbers? Because I have something completely different. Do you have the numbers to back up those percentages?
We do, Senator. This is the same methodology that we've used for years.
Okay, well, please provide me those numbers because we couldn't find them. The numbers I have, by the way, is last year, 63 million calls, and you responded, you answered 21 million for about a response rate of 33%. This year, the calls are way down. I think people just got discouraged. 26 million calls and 16 million were answered. So you actually answered less according to the numbers I got from the IRS. So I'd like to figure out what that discrepancy is.
Absolutely.
Secondly, with $45 billion flowing into your coffers on enforcement, I am highly concerned about how are you going to keep partisanship out of your enforcement efforts. You know, how do you make sure that enforcement is apolitical? You know, we have examples of the IRS being weaponized. The Tea Party, targeting the Tea Party. You know, the lack of enforcement, quite honestly, when we have emails showing Hunter Biden simply didn't disclose income. We don't see any enforcement action. And the most recent, and I say outrageous example of this, was journalist Matt Taibbi was testifying before the House Judiciary Committee in their weaponization of government. Basically, the day he's testifying, an IRS agent ends up showing up at his home. First of all, how common is that? Listen, I've filed a lot of tax returns, paid a lot of taxes. I've never had an IRS agent show up at my home or my place of business. I mean, how unusual is that to have an IRS agent show up at anybody taxpayer home is kind of the first notice that you've got an issue with your tax returns.
So first of all, Senator, I want to repeat something I said earlier, which is I'm prohibited from discussing.
Understand. So that's why I asked you a general question.
So I say that
what is the normal course of action for notifying a taxpayer if you're going to, for example, reject their tax return?
So we have made public for all taxpayers to see what they can expect from the IRS in terms of when we might call you, when a home visit might occur. It is something that we want to make sure that the taxpayers have an understanding of because there's a lot of scams out there. Mostly, if the IRS is reaching out to you, it's probably not the IRS. So we as part of our, yeah.
So I think this is pretty well documented that an IRS agent showed up, put a note on Mr. Taibbi's door, called them in 4 days, which he did. They explained what the situation is. I find that unbelievably unusual. And I'm asking you as IRS Commissioner, does that happen often? How unusual is that an IRS agent would show up at a taxpayer's home and tell them, give us a call? Now, throw on top of that, an IRS agent showing up at a taxpayer's home, that taxpayer just happens to be testifying before the House Judiciary Committee on the weaponization of government against U.S. citizens. I mean, the chance of that happening is infinitesimal, but it happened. So I'm just saying in general, how often does the IRS show up as the first notice that there may be an issue with the problem with the taxpayer's return and makes a personal appearance at that taxpayer's home? Is that part of your procedures? Does that happen very often?
Again, I want to be cautious in my answer to make sure that I am not violating a prohibition.
That's fine. Talk in general. How often does that happen?
I will talk generally. That if a taxpayer, if the IRS is reaching out to you directly, it is more likely the case that there has been some issue with your return. We've tried reaching you through less intrusive means. We have been unsuccessful. We want to help and get a handle on why you may not have filed, on why you might have an outstanding balance due.
You're not answering my question in terms of how often that would happen. My time's running out, so all I can say is I know Chairman Jordan has sent you and Secretary Yellen a letter requesting all the information on that. I will be sending a similar letter. I'd like it if the chairman would join me in that letter to get this information, because this is very troubling to have the IRS take that type of action. Again, the chances are so infinitesimally small that an IRS agent would show up at the journalist's door the day that journalist is testifying before a House committee. So I'm also going to be requesting that all the documentation, all the information on that specific case. I believe Mr. Taibbi has already issued a waiver for the IRS to provide that information. So I'm asking, will you comply with that, with those requests? Will you turn that information over to myself and to Chairman Jordan?
As long as we can do it consistent with Section 6103, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Johnson, you want to take another round?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Greenstone, I have to admit, I was surprised you've done all this research and you weren't aware of that Lancet July 2021 article comparing deaths caused by heat versus cold. But let me give you another question here. In a previous hearing, I asked the witnesses whether they knew how much we'd already spent on climate change. You're saying there's a $6 or $7 benefit for every dollar spent. So first of all, do you know how much we've already spent combating climate change globally? Do you have an estimate for that?
I'm unaware of a reliable estimate, Senator.
Okay. Anybody here? I'll tell you, we had a witness that said it was about $5 trillion. So if your multiplier is accurate, we should have already seen about a $30 to $35 trillion economic benefit from that $5 trillion. By the way, in the Inflation Reduction Act here, supposedly we've got a little under $400 billion of energy credits and dollars going to what I would call green energy boondoggles. Goldman Sachs estimated that cost about $1.2 trillion. So we dramatically understate how much we're going to spend on this. What I would say a futile effort to try and hold back the tides. Dr. Schellenberger, I read your book, Apocalypse Never, and I don't want to summarize it for you, but I will. It seemed like you were making the point that economic progress and having a strong economy is probably the most important thing to concentrate on, in spending like $5 trillion to apparently have no impact on our environment because there's still, people still saying world's going to end in 12 years, is wasting limited resources. Does that pretty well typify your views?
Yeah, that's definitely one way of describing it. I think the way to think about this issue in general is around energy transitions. And we go from wood and dung to coal, hydro, oil and gas to nuclear. Each step along the way, those transitions are made by the new fuel becoming cheaper and more abundant than the older fuel. It's simply not the case that we got a transition from coal to natural gas by making coal expensive. We didn't have a carbon price. I mentioned that we did not pass Waxman-Markey cap and trade, and yet we reduced our emissions by almost 22%. That's the story everywhere in the world. So these economic models are very misleading in that sense. And just to make one other point here, the Chairman Whitehouse mentioned this IMF study. That is an absolute garbage study. And I assure you that Mr. Greenstone, I do not think that he agrees with that study. That study counted as a subsidy for fossil fuels the externalities of fossil fuels. It counted the externalities and relabeled them subsidies, and it did not count the benefits. So it was a cost analysis, not a cost-benefit analysis.
So let's talk about the costs of green energy. Let's talk about the cobalt mining in the Congo, utilizing child labor. Let's talk about the mining of other rare earth minerals. We don't even have close to enough currently to produce what's being envisioned. Can you just kind of speak to, I would call it the fantasy nature of what is being proposed right now and what's being imposed on our economy?
Absolutely. So the supply chains for renewables and batteries are a total human rights and environmental nightmare. Start in the Congo with cobalt mining, which is absolutely barbaric. Many people have seen the videos of people being buried alive. In China, the solar panels are being made predominantly by Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. That's a part of China that the Biden administration says the Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority there. That's how our solar panels are being made. The calculations on the carbon intensity of solar panels appear to be totally incorrect because they're based on a cleaner European grid rather than the coal-based China grid. So total nightmare. And then the other final problem with renewables is because sunlight and wind are energy dilute, it requires 300 to 800 times more land and significantly higher number of projects to produce the same amount of energy as you would from a nuclear or natural gas plant. That's why there's 8,000 solar, wind, and battery projects in the United States right now that are not hooked up to the grid because they can't get enough transmission because of all the different land use problems and regulatory and cost burdens associated with moving from energy dense to energy dilute fuels.
So I'm highly concerned about the corruption of scientific inquiries, scientific studies, because they're being funded by organizations, sometimes government, that know what they want in terms of result. Can you just kind of speak to the problem that we're experiencing in terms of, for example, scientific studies that can't be repeated?
Yeah.
The corruption, medical journals, these other scientific journals.
Absolutely. I mean, we need evidence-based policy making, not policy-based evidence making, and yet that's what we've seen here. And we've seen it with the IMF study, we've seen it in many other studies where people have an outcome in mind, like 100% renewables, and then they proceed along a course to do things like shutting down nuclear power plants, increasing carbon emissions, making electricity expensive, preventing poor people from having access to air conditioning. So you're absolutely right. We need to have evidence-based policy making, not policy-based evidence making.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I will yield to Senator Johnson and note that I do not believe I badgered any witness.
I appreciate that. Here's one proposed solution, by the way, if we want to decrease the stress level on our children. It'd be nice if climate change alarmists would stop scaring the you-know-what out of our children by telling them that the world is going to end in a dozen years, okay? It's not. But let's talk about some realities. Does anybody here expect either India or China to quit trying to bring their people out of poverty and stop using fossil fuels? And anybody here think that's going to happen? Does anybody dispute that by their own models, if we were to eliminate all CO2 in America, it would have a negligible impact on global temperatures? Anybody want to dispute that one? Can somebody explain to me, I look at just some basic facts. Again, I don't deny climate change, I'm just not an alarmist. I look at the Vostok ice core sample, and I see we're in the 5th cycle now. Very, very consistent, 22.7 degree temperature variations over the span of 440,000 years. The Greenland ice core sample, the number of them, about 6.7 degrees over the last 10 to 20,000 years since the last glaciation period. This is the one that always shocks audience. It shocked me because we're always concerned about sea level rise, right? The increase in the sea level in the Bay of San Francisco since that last glaciation period, 390 feet. So any of our witnesses think that there's anything mankind could do or could have done to hold back the tides? The answer is no, there's nothing we could have done. So again, like Bjorn Lomborg talks about, is we have limited resources. Dr. Schramm talked about, we've been very effective at reducing some of these noxious pollutants that obviously impact health. Spend money on that. Spend money on cheaper energy, nuclear, right? I totally agree. But the environmental left generally has shut down nuclear plants. So if you're really concerned about CO2, and I'm not, I think it's a plant food, we'll adapt, but there's far better ways of spending money. Mr. Schellenberg, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that the nuclear issue just shows that maybe the people that are raising the alarm about this, there's an ulterior motive going on here. Something else is going on. I mean, we've got some big problems with renewables that we need to deal with. I mean, we have Steve Hayes from NOAA, who is top scientist at NOAA, that said that you can't have any more industrialization of the eastern seaboard without threatening the extinction of the North Atlantic right whale. It's extremely troubling. We're seeing a high number of dolphin and whale strandings, beachings since industrial wind activity occurred. So, I know that many people here support nuclear power, but we still don't have a plan to expand it. And that's the easiest and fastest way to transition away from fossil fuels without increasing electricity prices.
What big wind towers are ever repaired and put back in service? And what is the life of one of these wind towers? And how much copper goes into them? And what do we do with them? Again, we were just ignoring. There was a really good hearing. I saw a clip of it talking about these large trucks need 2 batteries, each weigh 8,000 pounds.
Absolutely. I mean,
again,
we talk about the externalities of fossil fuels, but what about the externalities of renewables? It's not like you can put solar panels on the compost bin and hope that they'll, decompose. There is no end of use for solar panels. Europeans dump them on African nations. For ours, go to landfills. Same thing with used wind turbine blades. It's because it's not cost effective to recycle them. So you have a huge waste problem from these solar panel and wind turbines and batteries that nobody's talking about.
So Dr. Greenstone, that would be a really good analysis for your research is take a look at the externalities and the cost of all this green energy, what's being proposed. Have you looked at that?
It's an excellent question. And I think one thing that I'm a little confused about the exchange with Mr. Schellenberger here is the planet doesn't care if we run solar, if we run wind, or nuclear for that matter. The planet only cares about CO2. So I think that's why many people interested in climate, certainly including myself, advocate for a market-based solution that penalizes the release of CO2 that is causing damages. So I find the debate about particular technologies a little confusing. And then I just want to add one point where I feel like there should be some agreement with Mr. Schellenberger and I, but I'm a little perplexed by it. He seems to be a big proponent of nuclear and was engaged in a kind of heated exchange with Senator Whitehouse. Well, if solar and wind are so great, the market would just adopt them. Well, the same challenge applies to the advocacy of nuclear. Nuclear plants aren't running, they're not being built because they're out of the money. The reason they're out of the money is they cost more than fossil fuels, and so fossil fuels have this kind of free subsidy. So I just come back to, we should aim for a level playing field that does not treat any technology better than the other, and stay focused on what the planet cares about, and that's CO2. It's not a particular technology.
Well, nuclear, we kind of regulated up the cost of that. Was Ms. Schellenberg, I think you should be able to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the planet does care. If you use 300 to 800 times more land for producing energy from solar and wind than you do out of nuclear, the planet does care. The North Atlantic right whales do care about that. If you produce solar panels in China with coal, those are high carbon intensive solar panels, in contrast if you made them in a place and you made them in France, which is mostly nuclear. So of course it matters. So and as nuclear, as you mentioned, I mean, California was shutting down a nuclear plant not because it was expensive, but because of anti-nuclear phobias that date back to the 60s. So nuclear is fundamentally just an issue of public concern. We over-regulated it. The people that pushed for that over-regulation were pushing for it because they were ostensibly scared of it, but they really favored renewables. There's a whole regulatory paradigm here that has to be taken into consideration.
And what about the economic or the environmental impact of mining?
Massive. I mean, that's why you look at what's happening in the Congo. I mean, just go online and look at cobalt mining in the Congo. It's a shame. What's happening in China, it's an absolute travesty. We should not be importing any more solar panels or batteries produced in China to the United States. It's just a fundamental human rights issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Johnson, then Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask all of you, anybody think we've got a great tax system? Anybody want to raise your hand and defend it? Anybody want to say that it's not a big old mess? So, first of all, my point always is what we ought to have done in 2017, what we ought to do now is simplify it and rationalize it. I never liked the word tax reform. One of my favorite sayings is, all change is not progress, all movement is not forward. And so we've just continued to complicate our tax system, and it really hasn't helped out a whole lot. One chart, speaking of charts, that I always found pretty interesting was this one that shows the top marginal tax rate in the pink block, and then this is since 1959. This is 60 years worth of history. As we've tried to punish success with this tax rate as high as 91%, 70%, 50%. It's kind of moderated down here a little bit below 40. But on average, we're able to collect about 17.3% of GDP in revenue. Now, I realize there's a lot of tax deductions, but still, it just seems like there's sort of an immutable reality that as hard as you try to punish success by increasing tax rates, you're just not able to squeeze much more than 17 to 18% out of our economy. Mr. Hodge, do you have any explanation for this?
Well, as long as we try to tax income, we're going to, and as long as Congress is going to have various deductions in the tax code, you're going to get those kind of results. If we move toward a more consumption-based tax, it'll be a lot steadier and a lot more efficient, and we won't have to resort to those kind of levels.
Mr. Bartlett, I would say you'd probably agree with Mr. Hodge in terms of simplification would be moving more toward a consumption-based tax as opposed to an income-based tax.
Oh, yeah, I think that's one area all economists agree on, that at least from an economic point of view, taxing consumption is better than taxing income. The problem, of course, that you run into is that it's a highly regressive form of taxation, and it's hard to offset the higher taxes that the lower income levels would pay.
I think another problem is if you add it to an income tax, you just end up raising massive revenue, which I do believe does hurt economic growth. One question I always try and ask those witnesses that are proposing more progressivity in our tax code, so I'll ask Mr. Kogan and Ms. Jacoby, what do you think is the maximum tax rate any American should pay on a dollar of income? Mr. Kogan.
Sorry. Thank you, Senator. I think that the maximum, you're talking about the average or the
No, I want you, what would you, again, if you're
sure. So
one of these wealthy guys that are, reinvesting their money and building a factory and providing jobs, I mean, how much do you want to tax that, that wealthy individual? What's
Sure. So Professor Saez estimated that probably the Laffer curve would end up at around 73%. So I think probably if you're going above 73%, you're no longer raising revenue. You could be going up there, but part of the issue is that...
I want your opinion. So you think we should have a top tax rate of 73%?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. What I meant to say is part of the issue is where the marginal rate is not really capturing is not really capturing your effective rate. I mean, part of the issue here is...
No, again, this is actually a pretty simple question. What is the maximum amount the federal government ought to take on $1 of income? What's the maximum amount? What's the maximum percentage?
Senator, I think it depends what has been happening below that rate.
Mr. Kobe, maybe you'll give me a straight answer. I mean, what in your dream world, if you could design a tax code, what would be the maximum rate you'd tax on income?
Yeah, I think your question is an important one to think about, but I think before we even get there, the tax code has to make sure that wealthy people are paying any tax at all. The way
why can I never get an answer on that?
Because
it actually just amazes me. What's so hard about saying, I want to tax income at X percent?
The question is, it takes away a lot of important context about the way the tax code is structured that allows wealthy people to avoid tax for their entire lifetime.
Again, I started this thing talking about simplifying and rationalizing their tax code. So I'm envisioning a very simple tax code. I don't want to socially or economically engineer through tax code. I want to raise the revenue we need with as little friction as possible. But again, I need from progressive witnesses, what is the maximum tax rate you're looking for? You want to take another stab before I run out of time here?
A simpler tax code would treat different types of income the same way, and right now it doesn't.
Okay. Let's assume that everything's treated the same. It's all treated. There's not different definitions. Income is income. A dollar is worth a dollar. How much do you want to tax?
When we get there, we can talk about a number. I'm not prepared to give you a number.
That's
Senator Kane.
That's cop out.
Thanks to the witnesses, and I'm sorry that I missed the opening discussion. I feel like I've come into one in midstream, but so I'll probably...
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Painter pointed out that money corrupts politics. Mr. Pelkey, you talked about climate change as big business. Do you believe also that money can corrupt research?
Yeah, absolutely. I study science and technology policy, and matters of financial conflict of interest are a big deal in the medical sciences, in energy, across the board. And it's important to have standards applied to make sure that conflicts of interest don't warp science one way or another.
Now, I think we've seen, certainly with the pandemic, the fact big pharma funds these studies, they don't release the data. Our federal health agencies aren't transparent. So again, I think this hearing shows that there's big money on both sides of the equation. There's nastiness on both sides, and it's hard to discern the truth. Mr. Walter, did you ever read the book, The New Leviathan, David Horowitz, 2012?
Certainly did.
So in that book, he lays out, just talking about progressive environmental groups versus conservative environmental groups. On the progressive side, again, this is in 2012, there are 553 groups that he identified. On the progressive side, 32 conservative groups. The net assets of the progressive groups was $9.53 billion. The net assets of the conservative environmental groups was $38.2 million. So it's a 249 to 1 advantage in terms of annual grants. And this is really the main part of his book. The progressive groups, whether it's environmental or whatever progressive group, they utilize their financial wherewithal to impact government, to get government to spend its money on their causes, whereas conservative groups basically just try to spend money on their causes. But the annual grants from progressive groups, $554 million per year spent on progressive, or granted to progressive environmental groups, 1.2 million for conservative groups. That's a 462 to 1 advantage. Is that kind of what you're talking about with Arabella and the whole issue of dark money? It's really dark money on the left that overwhelms the dark money on the right, correct?
That's absolutely right, Senator. And we did our own studies on this at climatedollars.org, and you can see the enormous left-wing advantage on this. If left-wing policies are not succeeding, it is not because there's big money on the other side.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter those facts from 2012 into the record if I could, and I'll provide that information to you. It is interesting in these...
The record will remain open for a week.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll do so.
For you to add whatever you wish.
You know, it's interesting we have these budget hearings, and as Ranking Member Grassley points out, we're really not talking about the budget. We're talking about climate change, which is fine. I'm enjoying them. I've got an open mind. I've never denied climate change. I'm just not a climate change alarmist because climate has always changed. I find it interesting on the majority witnesses, there really aren't very many scientists. We're bringing a few more environmental scientists on the minority, so you can't really get into the discussion on climate change. But I think it's interesting that Dr. Oresky, you say you actually are an earth scientist or something. So here's the questions I have that remain unanswered. Are you familiar with the Vostok ice core sample?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's 400 some. The most famous ice core, about 400 some thousand years of climate history, showing temperatures, average global temperatures at that spot, CO2 concentration, methane. You realize we're in about our 5th cycle. Temperature variation of 22.7 degrees. Also, you take a look at the sea level rise in the Bay of San Francisco, 390 feet over the last 10, 20,000 years. What caused that?
Well, the claim that climate has always changed is a claim that we hear all the time from people who are skeptical about climate change.
Well, it's true. I mean,
So let me explain. Let me answer the question. So yes, of course, the climate has always changed, and earth scientists have studied this for literally centuries. But the key point about anthropogenic climate change is that it's different from natural variability. And Lee DeBridge even said that in 1969. How do we know it's different? Because scientists have studied things like the ice cores, and we now see...
Again, you're not answering. What caused the 22.7 degree, those 5 cycles? What caused a sea level rise of 390 feet in the Bay of San Francisco? What caused that?
Natural variability is mostly caused by changes in the Earth's orbit. These have been well documented scientifically.
Did that change?
Yes, it changed.
Has that
because
stopped? I mean, have those
it has
phenomena
changed.
stopped?
It has changed because the human contribution has been added on top of it. Think about it this way.
Do you realize the CO2 concentration is a lagging indicator in the Vostok ice core samples?
Right, because we didn't have people putting CO2 into the atmosphere until the last 100 or 150 years. Think of it this way.
CO2 rise actually lagged temperature rise.
I'm trying to answer your question, Mr. Johnson. Natural variability is like a sine curve. It's like a radio wave. It goes up and down. The human forcing function is a linear curve that goes up, up, and up. So if you impose one on the other, what you get is something that looks like this. So the natural variability still exists. The Earth continues to have orbital variations. But in addition, we have added another component. And that component is the human forcing from greenhouse gases mostly produced by the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. And this has been documented in chapter and verse in numerous peer-reviewed scientific reports.
So are India and China going to stop using fossil fuels?
I'm sorry, what?
Will India and China stop using, quite honestly, will the U.S.?
Well, now you've changed the subject, but that gives
the answer is they won't, and there's nothing we can do about this.
They would have if we had followed the UN Framework Convention that President Bush signed in 1992. The whole point of that convention was to bring all the countries in the world on board, but that got derailed because the United States refused to.
According to testimony in this committee, we've spent over $6 trillion combating climate change. Probably haven't made a dent in it. We won't make a dent in it. This is a fool's errand we're on, and we're destroying our ability to have the resources to adapt to the climate change that's going to happen whether we do anything or not.
Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, because I think it's a fool errand to think you could ignore what has happened and not see serious consequences for the American people and the American taxpayer.
Senator Merkley. Yes. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems to me that the overall question we ought to be asking is, with limited resources, and we have limited resources, what's the best way to spend them? To make sure that we have a reliable grid, to make sure that we can mitigate against whether weather or climate change events and mitigate the problem of hurricanes and tornadoes and floods, that type of thing. One thing we can do is stop building in flood zones, account for the external costs, the externalities when it comes to building expensive properties on the coastal regions. Don't expect the federal government coming in, bail you out. So there's some common sense things we can do there. I'll ask Dr. Tierney, Dr. Kiernan, did you guys know how much we've spent in total trying to mitigate climate change globally?
I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I would be happy to follow up with you.
I'd like to hear that. We did have one witness from AEI said there's a pretty good estimate, about $5 trillion. In the Inflation Reduction Act, the green energy component of that was CBO costed about $400 billion, but Goldman Sachs said it's closer to about $1.2 trillion with a T. Throughout these hearings, we keep talking about different costs, a couple tens of billions here, 20 billion there, 50 billion there. We're talking $1,200 billion when I have no idea where that money is going to be spent. If it's going to be spent to mitigate climate change, I would argue it's probably going to be misspent because I don't think there's anything we can really do to hold back the tides. If we've already spent $5 trillion, people are still, hair on fire, concerned that the world's going to end in 12 years. It's not. Governor Bell Edwards, what you were talking about, the success you're having in Louisiana is a mitigation efforts, correct? I mean, wouldn't you like a more certain portion of that $1.2 trillion to use to mitigate against hurricanes, as opposed to $1.2 trillion spent on wind, solar? I don't know how cost-effective those things are going to be, what that's going to do, and I'll ask later, Ms. Espy, how does that affect the grid? But Governor Bill Edwards.
Well, I guess I have a difference of opinion with you, Senator. Louisiana is the most adversely affected state when it comes to climate change, and we produce more CO2 per capita than just about any other state in the nation. And I think we need to be acting on both fronts.
Do you think China or India are going to give up fossil fuels?
I'm not sure what they will do, Senator. I was taught to lead by example and from the front.
Sure. But 80% of our power is generated by fossil fuels, and we actually had a majority witness say that that's not going to change either. So again, we're just denying reality.
I'm not an enemy of fossil fuels. We've been a fossil fuel state for over 100 years. But it's clear to me if we're going to be an energy state in the next 50 years, we're going to embrace the transition. We will reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, increase our reliance on clean energy such as wind
I just think
and
that's
solar.
just not recognizing reality or economic reality.
And maybe
Ms. Aspey,
40% of our power is from non-carbon emitting
Ms.
power.
Aspey, I want to ask you, to what extent does the, wind power, solar power, what does that do in terms of grid reliability?
Yeah, look, wind and power does provide certain benefits to the transmission grid. It's available at times other units are not available. Look, the transmission grid, the concept is, right, is if you have it available across a broad regional, interregional infrastructure, when you don't have capacity or availability in one location, it's available somewhere else. You need the transmission infrastructure in order to transport the electrons to where it needs to go. We see benefits from wind and solar. There are times when wind and solar is not available. The sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. Just no different than, we need gas plants. We need diversity, we need optionality. Ultimately, diversity and optionality from a long-term perspective is going to be the best mechanism for our long-term energy security.
One of my concerns when I was Chairman of Homeland Security was the threat of EMP. I realize it's low probability but highly catastrophic, but even GMD. And I've been trying to get studies, I've been trying to get information, strategies in terms of what we need to do. From my standpoint, one of the most common sense thing to do would be to actually purchase and put in place large power transformers. Couldn't even get that in the current NDAA. Apparently there's some study that was part of the infrastructure bill, but there's no end date. We did talk to one transformer company, probably about 30,000 large power transformers. It costs about $60 to $90 billion to produce those and have them in place. Would that make sense from your standpoint, Ms. Aspey, because we would not be able to replace those power transformers in the event of either an EMP or a GMD event, correct?
There is a certain limited inventory of spare transformers across the country. Certainly, we have agreements with our neighboring utilities. Should indeed there be such an event that we need a transformer. Look, this country was built with many different voltage levels. So while I may have a certain transformer specification, my neighbor may have a different one. The other real issue from a transformer perspective is there's no domestic manufacturing of high voltage transformers in this country. We depend on the supply from other nations to supply our high voltage electric transformers.
So that is a huge vulnerability, and I guess what I'm arguing with limited resources, I would much rather see us spend $60 to $90 billion to purchase those now, put those in place offline in case you have one of those high catastrophic events, but we're not doing that. I think it's unfortunate because we're, again, trying to hold back the tide, spending $1.2 trillion, and it's just not going to work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Padilla, particularly grateful that Senator Padilla is here, given the infrastructure issues California is facing after the climate-driven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Had I not read my schedule, I would have thought maybe this hearing would have been titled "Our Broken Tax System," which, by the way, anytime we have the chairman of the Finance Committee, anytime you two want to sit down and work to simplify and rationalize our horribly complex and broken tax system, I'm all in. But this is a hearing on Medicare, and unfortunately, I think the chairman and so many Democrats are pretty much one-trick ponies. Whether it's Social Security, whether it's Medicare, the only solution is increasing taxes, which, again, I don't think we ever generate the revenue by increasing taxes because it harms economic growth. From my standpoint, if you're looking at how to fix Medicare, you've got to look at the root cause of the problem. And I would argue the root cause of the problem is the cost of health care. Why is it so grossly expensive, and out of whack with other nations? There are many reasons, but I would argue we have largely removed the benefit of free market competition out of health care across the board. And again, I come from the private sector. I didn't like competition. I would love to have been a monopolist because I had to compete. My prices were a lot lower. My quality was a lot higher, as well as my level of customer service was a lot higher. That's what a functioning free market system does. Unfortunately, in health care, only about 10 cents of every dollar is paid by the patient, and 90 cents is paid by somebody else. And so we have no idea what anything costs. There's really no consumerism involved. There's not consumers making wise choices. And calculating what something costs versus what the benefit is. So, Mr. Capretta, you did, in your testimony, mention 3 forms of competition. You said choice, you talked about premium competition, you talked about provider competition. I mean, would you basically agree with my assessment there that the root cause of this is we need to interject the benefits of a competitive marketplace into healthcare? And that's what we ought to be talking about here.
The answer is yes, but it's complicated, as you know, which is why it hasn't been done. In healthcare, I think it's important to understand there has to be some structure. There are some market failures in healthcare. I wrote a book recently. I'll make a plug for it. U.S. Health Policy and Market Reforms and Introduction. Kind of covers the, as an introductory matter, sort of different things that need to be done to bring more discipline from the marketplace into the health system. It can't be done, though, just by deregulation on its own. It has to be structured so that the person who's making a choice can see very clearly a price difference based on the same insurance plan or the same medical service. So that means in the insurance context, standardization of the benefits so that the premium difference is very clear.
Let me quickly interject. I think also you need to separate healthcare costs in terms of the catastrophic costs that need insurance and the non-catastrophic that people could pay for out of their pocket. I think, if we could separate that in some way, shape, or form as opposed to paying for everything. I have limited time. I also want to talk about figure 1. You talked about the fiscal challenge. I would call it a fiscal crisis. It's a slow-moving train running right at us, and it's, Washington, D.C. is not addressing it. We're, as you said, about a $2 trillion deficit this year. We're spending $1.9 trillion more this year than we did just 4 years ago. And your figure 1 is pretty stark, showing that about half of Medicare costs are going to be provided by the general revenue fund. That we're going to have the same problem with Social Security when the trust fund runs out. If we're going to plus up those benefits, we're going to need revenue out of the general fund. And the question I have is, will we have the financial wherewithal to plus up those benefits, to meet the requirements of what Medicare is going to need in terms of financing? And that starts to speak to prioritization of spending. We've used this committee for climate change and the budget. Talking about, by the way, in testimony, over $5 trillion has been spent globally combating climate change. I would argue it obviously hasn't made a dent because we still have climate change alarmists. $5 trillion. We're in the Inflation Reduction Act, another $1.2 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs study, is what is going to be spent because of that piece of legislation. We need to start prioritizing what limited resources we have to the priorities of government. And again, I would say Social Security and Medicare, those promises we made to seniors would be top priorities, and maybe these green energy boondoggles that are not going to fix climate change would probably be a lower priority for spending. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I don't think so. I'm not an expert in the...
Okay, set aside climate change, just in terms of we need to get our arms around these massive deficits, this massive debt, or we're not going to have the financial wherewithal. We'll have a debt crisis, and then this all comes crashing down, correct?
I do think we are headed towards some major dislocation if we don't get fiscal discipline into our budget process. So I would very much recommend, on a bipartisan basis, that both sides get together and start working through some of the challenges of getting the debt down, deficits down, so we don't pile up as much as we're projected to in the coming decade, and certainly over the coming 30 years. It's really a very big problem, and it's going to require both taxes and spending.
But also prioritization of spending. Okay, thank you, Mr. Capretta. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Now Senator Kane is walking in as his time comes. Would you like a moment to get yourself
Mr. Chair, if anyone else hasn't asked questions, I would rather that they go before me, or has
well,
everyone
Senator
asked?
Johnson has already had his round, but he's been waiting patiently for a second round. So I'd be more than happy to give him 5 minutes and then turn to you.
That would be great.
Let's do that.
Well, really, just to
get an extra round, Senator Johnson.
I appreciate that. So just to make the point, Senator Brown was talking about revenue percentages and spending percentages. Year 2000, total spending was 17.7% of GDP, according to Mr. Capretta's Table 2. Revenue was 20%. So we had a surplus. This year, 2022, revenue is 19.6%. Those are pretty historic highs. As Senator Brown, generally we're somewhere between 17 and 18%. So we're historically high. By the way, and that 17%, 18% is regardless of what the maximum tax rate is. I mean, we've had tax rates in excess of 70%, and you're still raising about 17, 18%, because, again, we have such a broken and complex tax system, all kinds of loopholes. The government can only collect X percent, and kind of 20% is sort of the top level right there. But the difference this year is spending is 25.1%. So again, when we had a surplus, spending was 17.7%. Now that we have massive deficits, spending is up to 25.1%, which brought me to the conclusion that we better start prioritizing spending. We just can't continue to spend a quarter of our GDP through the federal government, because we'll never be able to raise the revenue. No matter what you do, you just can't get 25%. You can't squeeze that out of the American taxpayer. So we better recognize that reality. And again, I would point out that the solution is what Senator Brown was talking about is, how do you reform the healthcare system, and as I was talking about, to reintroduce consumerism? And I'll say, separate out the two different types of spending. And I wouldn't mind Mr. Capretta talking a little bit more about that. Medical services. I mean, the routine care that we all go in, that, for example, Medicare. We got a waiver during COVID for telehealth that then expires, and all the medical providers in Wisconsin are saying, can you extend that exemption? Because telehealth worked really well. Well, why would they even need an exemption? Because it's government run, it's bureaucratic, and makes no sense. So when you have government regulation, government bureaucracy, it just prevents providers from being imaginative, showing some real progress in terms of how to deliver things more efficiently. Again, what this free market does, best possible price, best quality, best level of customer service. Again, that's what the free market does. Why don't we introduce more of that? Ms. Capretta, just real quick, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think we're on the cusp of maybe doing some of that with the price transparency requirements that have been put in place. Some of it might be statutory if the Congress moves ahead. But there needs to be more standardization of packaged benefits. And by the way, I would agree with the comment that not all of healthcare is going to be subject to consumer discretion. There are a lot of studies of this, and it's going to be probably about 40%. So there's some big ticket items where you can't shop.
Okay, so real quick.
But there are some things where you can.
You're saying about 40% would be kind of what you earlier referred to as medical services.
Yes.
And then then 60% would be, again, the catastrophic care, the things you need insurance for.
Yes.
Correct?
Correct. It would be big things where it's not really a packaged, discernible item. It's going to be some ongoing event with unknown outcomes. And so you're going to spend a lot of money, and you can't really shop for it.
Look, you mentioned transparency. I know there's a lot of talk about that. Again, you introduce free market competition, you automatically get transparency because consumers are asking, what does it cost? My concern about government-regulated transparency, it'll be fudged. I mean, it's just not going to work as efficiently as a free market system that just demands price transparency. And that's nobody knows what anything costs in healthcare. I mean, nobody knows.
The only point I would make there, Senator, on the other side is that when a consumer wants to buy a surgery, for instance, they need to have the surgeon in, the anesthesiologist, the radiologist, the diagnostics.
Yeah, but
they need a packaged benefit that they can figure out and price.
That's the insurance side of the market. That's the insurance side. The example I use is eye care. People do pay for that out of pocket. So, LASIK surgery has dramatically come down in price because consumers know what it costs. They understand the benefit. If we get more of healthcare in that model, and then look at the insurance model, and again, prepackage it, have it very standardized. When I was in business, it drove me nuts buying insurance because you always had to look at, well, what does this plan exempt? It made no sense. I mean, they just exempted certain conditions to save money. So there wasn't transparency in that insurance, and that's where I would definitely go toward specific models. This, coverage A covers all these things. Coverage B covers this, and have that standardized. That you would require government regulation.
I'm very much for that, yes.
Okay, good. Well, we got some solutions here, Mr. Chairman.
With that, we turn to the patient, Senator Kane.
Not patient, I needed to adjust my brain into the right committee, so thank you, Senator Johnson and Mr. Chair.
moment for a question or two, you're recognized.
First of all, I appreciate this hearing. I really do. Thank the witnesses. I like the hearing title, Philosophy on AI, because I think it's crucial. I've been interested in science fiction all my life, and I've actually, not only have we've been holding these seminars or hearings here in the Senate trying to understand what this is, but I've also been reading some pretty interesting science fiction books. Science fiction writers are, unbelievably prescient. And these things are researched pretty well, and so these things go off in different directions and some pretty troubling directions, which is, I think, what the chairman was talking about in his opening remarks, as well as what you're talking about. Professor Valor, you're talking about our capacity to regulate this and our ability to do so. President Eisenhower, in his farewell address, not only talked about the military-industrial complex, he also warned us about government funding science and research. And that would lead to scientists more concerned about obtaining a government grant than really addressing pure scientific knowledge. It could lead to a scientific and technological elite that drove public policy. I think that's the concern with AI. He was concerned about human beings that were technologically and scientifically elite. Now we've got computer capability that's going to vastly outpace our ability in terms of volumes and speed of calculations. And it's highly concerning. I would argue just the latest pandemic. Scientific research was certainly looking at how to take a virus with gain of function, make it more dangerous, and then come up with a countermeasure, anticipating biological warfare. I would argue that obviously got out of hand. We don't know the exact origin, but I guess I'm less convinced that we're going to really be able to control this and that we've got the governing capacity to do so. It's hard to really put a question in on this, but this is an incredibly important issue and question, and I just really don't know whether this dysfunctional place is going to come up with the right answers. I think of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Again, I'm not a computer scientist. I can't even begin to grapple with how they create these algorithms, and we've got a few smart people that know this that are warning us about a certainly possibility of AI destroying this country, destroying humanity. I guess just speak to that.
Happy to. Thank you very much. So I think the important point in what you're saying is that AI today is an accelerant of many of the dynamics that are currently present in our society, in our economy. And among those, for example, is rising economic inequality and declining social and economic mobility, which has been an issue now in this country for decades. And one of the greatest worries about AI is that it will accelerate those trends unless we actively govern AI in ways that ensure that its benefits are realized by everyone who has a right to have the infrastructure that AI will build serve them. So I'll just say that I think the fact that we have done this in the past with other technologies that were at the time equally unprecedented, equally powerful, equally challenging to regulate, actually, if we have the political will, leaves us in a better place than we have ever been to govern a complex technology like AI, because we have 200 years of experience in regulatory innovation, in adjusting the incentives for powerful actors. It has been effective before. That is why airplanes now are safer than driving. That would not have happened if we had stepped back and let airlines operate without any kind of regulatory oversight, accountability, or constraint.
But regulating transportation devices is completely different, and I would even say nuclear power versus nuclear weapons is completely different than this that we can't even begin to grapple with once this is unleashed and it's starting to learn and maybe even becoming self-aware, what is that going to actually result in? Professor Asamoglu, pretty close. You talked about, you've all talked about growing inequality. I would argue that we've put ourselves in a huge pickle over the last couple generations as we've told all of our children, you have to get a four-year degree. To me, the greatest threat AI represents to loss of jobs are those college-educated kids. That machines can learn a lot quicker, and you're seeing what is happening with ChatGPT. Certainly, we're seeing a real shortage of workers in manufacturing, in the trades. We're always going to need those folks. And unfortunately, certainly in Wisconsin, those employers trying to hire people, our kids aren't doing it because we send them all to college, and they think that kind of work is beneath them. So they're screaming for legal immigration reform, which I'm all for. But here's an instance where we didn't really regulate, but society en masse told all of our kids, you have to get college educated, thereby implying that being in construction or being a tradesperson was somehow a lesser occupation, second-class citizen. I think all work has value. Why don't you speak to that in my remaining time?
Well, that's a very, very important point. I have also come to believe, exactly like you said, that we have undervalued a lot of important work, but we haven't just undervalued it philosophically. We have also failed to create the right training environment and the right technologies for these workers. It is a tragedy in this country that we have a tremendous shortage of skilled craftspeople, electricians, but they're not even paid that well.
And they're starting to get paid well.
Sorry?
They're starting to get paid
They're
well.
gonna get paid somewhat better because of scarcity, but they can be paid even more if we create the right environment for them to acquire more expertise and provide the tools for them. And the promise of AI is really, if we strip all of the hype, is really in doing that. Because what is generative AI good at? It's taking a vast body of knowledge and some specific context and finding what's the relevant bit of that vast body for that specific context. So that's a great technology for training, that's a great technology for boosting expertise. And that's the way to actually use AI in a way that's not inequality inducing. Now, you've raised another very important point, which many economists also make, which is, well, these ChatGPT-like technologies are gonna go after, college-educated jobs. I'm not actually sure. This is not the first technology that has been promised to automate white-collar workers or white-collar work and therefore reduce inequality that way. My work finds that many of these technologies end up actually going after the lower skill jobs. Like, you're not gonna automate managerial jobs or those people who have power, but you're gonna do it to the sort of IT security type jobs, which are not very well paid anyway. And moreover, that's not a very effective way of reducing inequality, because what happens to people who, say, used to do IT security or advertisement writing, etc., they go and compete for other white-collar jobs that were lower paid, and the burden again falls on lower educated workers. So you're 100% right. Four-year college for everybody is not the solution, but skills for everybody, building expertise for everybody is the right solution.
Sorry I can't stay around. This really is a important subject. Thank you. I think we need to focus a lot more on the root cause of this problem, and we're getting close to it. I think a number of the witnesses have said it's the low prices, it's the race to the bottom. I think you have to find out, well, what's causing that? Now, I haven't heard the word monopsony purchasing power yet, where you've got basically the federal government with their drug formulary pretty well driving most of these prices. I would ask the witnesses, can you think of a common consumer product that is always in persistent shortages? Can anybody think of one? There may be some, but the reason there aren't is you've got millions, billions of consumers, and the marketplace takes care of all these problems. It demands higher quality. It demands better levels of customer service. It demands the best price. But because we have the federal government getting involved in the healthcare marketplace, it screwed everything up. Third-party payer systems through insurance is another kind of monopsony type of purchasing power as well. So we need to focus on what can we do to bring consumers back into the process here. I'm a manufacturer. I supplied medical device industry for years. We actually were able to, and our customer allowed us to charge a higher price to stabilize their price over a number of years, but also to ensure supply. Mr. Coquille, that's basically your company's approach to this. You increase costs by having buffer stock, correct? So you're able to provide a service. You'd probably be considered a middleman. And because if your company makes any money off this, generally the members of this committee would be criticizing you for skimming off the top and driving up prices, but you actually provide a service. Isn't that correct?
Thank you, Senator. We're a manufacturer, but part of what we do in contracting with hospitals is bypass the middleman in the transaction. So we work directly with hospitals. We don't go through the GPO contracting process.
That's a marketplace solution, okay?
That's a marketplace solution.
Dr. Wazinska, because when we were talking about PBM reform here, which, by the way, I'm the only one of this committee that voted against what the committee is trying to do here, because I don't understand how it's going to fix any problem. One of the questions I asked staff was, if this is going to lower prices for consumers, why is Big Pharma in favor of the PBM reform that they're proposing? Again, we're talking about right now shortages caused by a race to the bottom, too low prices. I mean, isn't it true that PBMs are negotiating lower prices for the organizations they're representing, and it's just not transparent in terms of how those prices get benefit consumers, because it benefits them in lower insurance costs and that type of thing? You want to respond?
Yeah, so PBMs really play a role in the oral dose market, not generic sterile injectables. They don't deal with hospitals, and really their role here is because they are a major pharmacy. This is the vertical integration. That's the piece, really not the contracting, but the fact that they own mail order pharmacies and that they also have specialty pharmacies. And just like any other specialty, they're incentivized to bring the lowest cost. What they mark up and how this is this shows up to the payers is a difference.
They're putting downward pressure on drug prices, correct?
Yes, there's absolutely downward pressure. And just to your previous question and your previous point about sort of where things break down and why is it that the consumer suffers, I just would like to highlight this. There's a lot of players in the chain, and each one of them is incentivized very differently, and they don't internalize the harm that results to patients. And I will say it's including, if you think about the cost on hospitals from shortages, $360 million, that's $60,000 per hospital.
In a free market, there would not be these shortages, certainly not with generic drugs. It just wouldn't occur, but it's not a free market. Government has interfered and screwed it all up. One point I want to make, because I think this is an enormous national security threat, is the fact that we do not, by and large, produce precursor chemicals. We do not produce the active pharmaceutical ingredients. I'm not for general economic engineering, but in this case, I think we do need Buy American provisions. Now, again, as you said, we're going to have to pay higher prices, but one of the reasons you have these huge markups, from the middlemen, is when you have a shortage. So if you didn't have those shortages, you wouldn't have those instances where people are responding to the marketplace, driving costs up 1,000 times. If you eliminated the root cause of the shortages, bring back more consumerism, get rid of the monopsony type of buying power, that'd be a solution. But we do need to address, and we haven't. We have this infrastructure bill. I don't think we spent a penny on trying to bring back the manufacture of precursor chemicals and API to America. That is an enormous national security threat, and we're just ignoring it. Anybody want to comment on that?
If I could speak to this briefly, I completely agree with you that we need to be thinking about sort of the geopolitical threats. Where we face a challenge is that the enormity of this problem. To onshore everything into the United States, I don't know, trillions of dollars. What we need is to be really strategic about what are the essential medicines and which ones are really vulnerable?
It would not be trillion, it wouldn't be trillions. Again, the marketplace would respond to it if we allowed the marketplace to do it. But we're not. We're trying to do this through government control, and again, just government screws things up.
The time of the
Thank you, Mr.
gentleman's
Chairman.
expired.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I want to second what you said earlier. I've been here more than 12 years, and this is probably some of the most powerful, important, and on-point testimony I've heard. I mean, you've done an extraordinary job under a difficult situation laying out what the facts are and what the problem is, plus what the solution is. It is accountability, it's exposure, it's naming and shaming. It's pretty obvious what has to be done, and it's also pretty obvious that it hasn't been done. You know, you can only talk about improving culture so long before you actually start doing it, and the only way you do it, again, accountability, exposure, the truth, naming and shaming. Here's my disconnect. I'm a father, I have daughters, I have a sister. I can't even watch a rape scene in a movie, much less even begin to contemplate what it's like to be raped, okay? It's horrific. Murder's bad, but it ends, right? Rape just continues. It's a horrific crime against another person. So you've got men serving in these, in these commands. I don't understand why they don't come to grips with this. Why they aren't outraged. And listen, I'm sure there are instances where it's kind of, there are he said, she says. I understand the difficult nature of some of this stuff, but some of this is so clear cut. And you've got DNA evidence, that type of thing. Can somebody explain that to me? The other disconnect is, I think, almost to a person, you're saying you love the Coast Guard. So there's obviously good elements there. They're obviously, and I would hope the vast majority are good people that are serving there, that are patriots, that are defending our freedom and look out for each other. But why does this, can you get down to the core of why this has been allowed to go on? I'll start with you, Commander Yount.
Wow.
Does the question even make sense to you?
Well, the question makes sense. I'm not sure that I have an answer, but I would say, from my experience, particularly as a cadet, there were two things that were really predominant. Certainly one is alcohol. A lot of the experiences were definitely alcohol-based.
But that's what might have led to the instance. I'm talking about why the cover-up.
Right. The cover-up.
Again, in our era, okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in your testimony that there was certainly an attitude back then that women don't belong here.
Right. Oh yeah.
And there was does that attitude still continue? Decades later.
Well, you'd have to ask Kara that one.
Senator, if I may, that attitude does not continue. My class is 40% female, and our top cadets in our class are female as well. And I would like to just touch on a little bit of what your question is asking. Men are outraged as well. Men and women are both victims of sexual assault in the Coast Guard. And I have many mentors who are men who are supporting me today and who were outraged when they heard about my story. So I don't think that there's anyone in the Coast Guard that isn't outraged about this. But talking a little bit more about our culture, we have this saying, it's called shipmate self. So first you gotta take care of the ship. Then you got to take care of your shipmates, and then you can finally take care of yourself. And so really what I saw and still see today is with your peers. When you come forward and talk about an assault that has occurred, especially in my case, he was a popular basketball player. His friends came to my room and they said, "You're going to ruin his life."
He kind of ruined yours.
Exactly. That was my argument.
You're also a shipmate.
I am.
Ms. Merrow, in your testimony, it was striking. But when I need them to testify to what they had witnessed, they were silent.
Yes, they were.
I mean, you had other people you had helped, and then when you need them to come forward to testify, and my guess is that's common, and that's really sort of the heart of this, is why, I mean, is it literally, I'm not going to get a promotion? I mean, again, sure, shipmate, but you're a shipmate too. So that one doesn't quite explain it. There's something else going on here, like omerta. I mean, there's help me understand that. Why didn't your friends come forward and say, this is wrong? We need to end this. We need to expose this. Again, accountability, exposure, name and shame. These people got to be drummed out of the service so this doesn't happen anymore. Again, you make some very public examples of few people, and by and large, that's going to go a long way towards solving this problem, but they haven't done that. They haven't even begun to do that. Years, decades later, talking about changing the culture, but they're not doing the one thing that has to be done. But again, I'm filibustering, sorry.
It's okay. You're making way too much sense, Senator. I have those very same questions. And to piggyback off of what Kira had just mentioned about her perpetrator's friends coming to her room to intimidate her, the same thing happened with me. And in this particular instance where I had accused the now lieutenant commander, who was a fourth class with me, when I was assaulted. I was groped in a room with 30 of my peers. And they watched and they laughed. And these are people, like I said in my testimony, who I had quite literally pushed over the wall in the obstacle course, or literally carried on my back during swim tests. Imagine that, people joining the Coast Guard who don't know how to swim, I had to carry them on my back. And so when it came time for them to speak up about what they had seen, they were so fearful that they kept their mouth shut. It's just plays into the culture of cronyism that exists, and I can't imagine that it's changed very much, because there is that deep fear of losing your career, like I did. I was the one that was pushed out instead.
So Mr. Chairman, my time's up, but again, I think largely the solution is known. It is what we're doing here. It's accountability. It is then, the only way you get accountability is you have to expose it. You need to tell the truth. And you have to tell the truth about individuals, and they're going to have to be held accountable, and they're going to have to pay a penalty for doing this. And if we do that effectively, hopefully we can impact this to a significant degree, but we need to use every power we have as Congress. And we've allowed those powers of oversight to atrophy. We can't allow that anymore. I mean, across the board in these investigations, we need to demand accountability from these agencies. And we start here with the Coast Guard. And again, I appreciate you holding this. Again, I can't tell you how impactful this testimony is. We've got to do something about it, okay? And we know what we need to do.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, if you have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I would hope back then, the 40s, the rationale of trying to keep women out of the services because they want to protect them, right? So now we're in there, women are showing how valuable they are, and we're still not doing a very good job protecting them, okay?
That's exactly right, sir. We were trying to protect them from the enemy, and yet the enemy within is the problem now.
So, Ms. Morrow, I hope you're successful in your FOIA request, but my guess is if you are, that's what you're going to get. Mr. Chairman, so what I would suggest, the first subpoena we should issue, and we ought to not wait, is subpoena the records to be delivered to Ms. Morrow. Not to the committee, but to Ms. Morrow. She deserves to have her service records, and she deserves to have them now. So I would request that if it's possible, to subpoena delivered to somebody else. Again, this is a private issue. She can get that, and she can do whatever she wants to, but she deserves those service records. So I would request we issue that subpoena. I would also say, because we have someone currently serving here, first-class cadet Holmstrup, we have all kinds of whistleblower protections in law, and they're not very effective, okay? It's really sick, quite honestly, how effective and pervasive retaliation is against people, courageous people to come forward and report to Congress. So I want to make sure that the Coast Guard, the service are on notice that this committee will not tolerate any retaliation. against any witness here, okay? I think that's extremely important. Then the last thing, I just, again, want to talk about how effective and important this testimony was. I had my opening question just basically asking why. I mean, why doesn't somebody step forward? And in answering Senator Hawley's question, I was particularly talking about your case, Ms. Merrill. If you're the commandant there looking for a promotion, and all of a sudden you see this scandal that could erupt where a female cadet is groped while 20 other cadets witnessed it and giggled about it. Okay, now you're going to lose a class, what about 20, 30, maybe more individuals? You can understand, again, I'm not condoning it at all, but you help me understand why this has not been addressed. When it's all about promoting, and boy, is that going to be a stain on my career. I don't want to be the commandant of the academy when that scandal erupted. And so I would imagine there's an awful lot of pressure. Again, not condoning it at all. But thank you again for your testimony. You've gotten me to understand a whole lot more about what the problem is. But again, as witnesses, you've all basically said the solution here is accountability, which requires exposure, which requires the truth, which requires this committee to be absolutely dedicated to subpoenaing and making sure that these records are made available so we can expose it, we can get the truth, and there can be accountability. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.